Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace, and today is January 12th, 2022. I've got to start to get used to saying 2022. And I am delighted to have with me today two experts, Nuriya Oswald and Yael Stein. Nuriya is International Advocacy Officer at Mezan Center for Human Rights. This is the Palestinian human rights NGO founded in 1999 and based in the Gaza Strip. Welcome, Nuriya. And with Nuriya, we have Yael. Yael is the Director of Research for Btselem, Israel's preeminent human rights organization. And we actually had Yael on a webinar last year, which was terrific. I'm very, very happy, Yael, to have you back. So I'm also proud to say that Mezan and Btselem are both partners and grantees of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. We are so proud of that. So thank you, Nuriya and Yael, for joining me today. And the purpose of having you join me today is to talk about the situation in the Gaza Strip, including the Israeli policies and actions that define the lives of Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip and the impunity Israel grants itself with respect to its actions toward them. Nuriya, I want to start with you. A few weeks ago, Al-Mezan issued a blockbuster report entitled "The Gaza Bantustan, Israeli Apartheid in the Gaza Strip." And we'll have a link to that report with the text that accompanies this podcast/video. Now, the report, I'm going to quote it. The report, quote, "considers how Israeli apartheid experienced by all Palestinian people is specifically visited upon the 2 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip." And it describes Gaza, obviously, from the title as being like a South African Bantustan, even while noting the conditions are actually arguably worse than in Bantustans. So can you introduce us to this analysis? And as in, what is apartheid in the Gaza Strip? What do you mean? And how is it distinct from discussions of apartheid in Israel/Palestine, whether you're talking from the river to the sea, as some people do, or specifically in the West Bank?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Lara. So I want to confirm at the start that Al-Mezan's finding is indeed that Israel's committing apartheid against all Palestinians. So against those in Gaza, yes, and that's what our recent report focuses on, but also against Palestinians in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Israel, and in the diaspora as well. And we've been working for years with partners, mainly Palestinian human rights organizations, to flesh out this analysis, including by submitting to the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. That's one of the UN's treaty bodies, and it imposes obligations on states, and to the International Criminal Court. And in that communication, we also focused on the related crime of persecution. So for years, Palestinian voices have outlined how Israel, throughout its ongoing colonization and military occupation, has established an apartheid regime that grants people of Jewish faith and Jewish Israelis a superior status to the status of Palestinians, and doing so based solely on racial grounds. Now, our current report builds on that work and intends to add to the growing international recognition that recognition of Israeli apartheid, against all Palestinians. Now, Al-Mezan has a mandate that focuses on Gaza. We have 23 years of documentation from our presence on the ground. And so we decided to zoom in on Gaza, which to my knowledge, no other report has done, and to see how Israel's policies in relation to Gaza meet the threshold for the crime of apartheid. And we started from the point of the closure, which is unique to Gaza. It's the policy that encloses residents in an isolated enclave. It's the policy that led us to draw parallels between Gaza and the Bantustans of South Africa. But yes, as we note in the report, and according to Professor John Dugard, who we quoted, the conditions in Gaza are arguably worse. But it was the similarity in the forced isolation and the enclave-like nature of the Bantustans that led us to draw that parallel. We also looked at the Israeli military's regular use of force in the buffer zone in Gaza. That force is mostly aimed at farmers. It's aimed at fishermen during the Great March of Return, at protesters. And we looked at the recurrent military targeting of civilians and civilian homes. And this is within the larger scale military escalations like the one that we saw in May 2021. And we looked at the regular arbitrary arrest and detention of children and other vulnerable groups in Gaza, another group being patients who need to access the Israeli-controlled crossing for medical care. And we did this analysis through the prism of the Apartheid Convention and concluded that the practices that I've just listed, that they amount to what are called inhuman acts. And these are acts, it's conduct that is a requisite part of the crime of apartheid. So along with having an institutionalized system of domination and oppression and an intent to maintain that system. And we argue that these acts are perpetrated for the express purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group, being Israeli Jews, over another racial group, being Palestinians. And that the laws, the policies, and the practices that are implemented against Palestinians in Gaza are from the same institutionalized system of discrimination, and that they fall under the same intent that makes up Israeli apartheid against all Palestinians.
Thank you. That's a great introduction. And maybe when I come back to you on something else, we could talk a little bit about like what the term buffer zone means. So I don't want to assume that everyone knows that. And if you want to mention that now, I do want to ask you as a follow-up, there's this, in terms of distinguishing between the treatment of Palestinians outside of Gaza and inside of Gaza, the report talks about oppression, segregation, and fragmentation, which have specific meanings that are different, talking about Gaza versus Area C, for example, or Jerusalem. And I want to just quote this. It says, while the Israeli government purports to justify the closure and related restrictions under the guise of quote unquote security, the report will show how these policies demonstrate Israel's intent to separate and divide Palestinians and re-engineer the demographics of the entire Palestinian population in order to assert its domination over them. As part of this, you talk about the overarching goal to dominate all Palestinians. Can you talk a little bit about how that works specifically, why that is Gaza being geographically distinct from the rest of Palestine, how it's different there? We have a closure, which is for years, we have military actions, and then we have things like the buffer zones. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the analysis that we've done over the years shows that Israeli apartheid is deployed differently depending on the location of the population and Israel's other aims and policies in place in that area. So whereas annexation is clearly the aim in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, either formal or de facto, and the prevention of return is Israel's goal for Palestinians in exile, which of course plays into its demographic aims. It then appears that for Gaza, the goal is isolation and destruction. So the Israeli authorities are really instrumentalizing the system of apartheid in different ways. When it comes to Gaza, Israel first uses the closure, as you said, and the state attempts to justify this policy through a security argument. But we have to be clear that the Israeli authorities can implement effective security measures without resorting to a system of collective punishment, without violating an entire spectrum of fundamental and inalienable rights of the population. It can do so without banning chocolate, ketchup, children's toys, which you might remember were on the list of banned dual-use items at one point. It can do so without banning fishermen from Palestinian territorial waters, without subjecting patients to, an arbitrary, slow, complex permit process in order to get urgent medical care. The list goes on. It could do so without prohibiting families from, uniting and celebrating weddings and births together, preventing Palestinians from Gaza from marrying, Palestinians in the West Bank, for example. But instead, the Israeli authorities enforce this unwarranted and strict closure. And we say in the report that this has to be understood in light of its overarching goal to separate and divide the Palestinian people, to fragment them in disconnected territorial and also legal domains. And it does so in order to better administer, essentially, its system of domination. So, albeit through different methods of procedure and, using the closure, using the buffer zone, which we actually more commonly refer to as the access restricted area. And it's an area in the Gaza Strip that Palestinians are essentially unable to enter. It's on Palestinian territorial land, or they have restricted entry and have to get permission and can only grow certain crops in that area, etc. It actually falls on 35% of Palestinian agricultural land in Gaza. And it also encompasses parts of Palestinian territorial waters. And it means that anyone who enters that area could be subjected to the use of live fire, right? It's part of Israel's militarized maintenance of the closure. And so there are different methods of procedure that Israel uses within its apartheid regime, but the state is working towards the same overarching goal. And that's being two main factors: to enlarge Israeli territorial control and to ensure a Jewish Israeli majority.
Thank you. Terrific. And I should mention, since you mentioned dual use, that another organization that we are partners with, Gisha, issued a report yesterday on Gaza and the Israeli regime and dual use as a method of preventing or of control and preventing entry of basic things into Gaza. Highly recommended. So thank you, Nuriya. Yael, let's turn to you. So last year, Btselem released a blockbuster report on apartheid as well, and we did some events around that entitled, the report was "A Regime of Jewish Supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is Apartheid." And we'll include a link to that as well with this podcast / video. So that report specifically, among other things, discusses Israel's denial of rights to Palestinians in Gaza. So just a few weeks ago, around the same time that Mezan issued their report, Btselem released a new report focused on Gaza, published together with the Palestinian Centre for Human Rights, entitled "Unwilling and Unable: Israel's Whitewashed Investigations of the Great March of Return Protests." And those protests were mentioned just a moment ago by Nuriya. So that report analyzes the investigations Israel claims to have conducted following the Great March of Return protests. This is a year and a half ago, March 2018. There'll be a link to that report. And those protests and that response demonstrate, according to the report, and I think I would agree, what the denial of political rights looks like in this regime. And you wrote, quote, "Israel labeled the Gaza protests as illegitimate before they even began. This reflects the view employed by the apartheid regime throughout the occupied territories, whereby Palestinians are not entitled to political rights, including freedom of protest." So can you talk to the audience a little bit? First, remind us what happened at the Great March of Return. Why are we even talking about this a year and a half later? What went down, and how did Israel respond, which is so emblematic of this regime?
Okay, thank you. I also, just before I start to talk about the demonstrations themselves, I just want to connect to what Nuriya said before, because I think it shows what Israel is always trying to hide, that Israel is still controlling Gaza. What happens inside Gaza, not just by controlling the gates and the entry to the Gaza Strip, but also what happens on the daily life inside the Gaza itself. I mean, we are talking about demonstrations that were held since in 2018 inside Gaza borders. It had nothing to do with Israel, even though before it even started, Israel published that it will never allow those demonstrations to happen. It will shoot live ammunition on people who will participate in those demonstrations. And again, it's not on Israel's territory. So the fact that Israel even thinks that it can tell the people in Gaza whether they can demonstrate, about what they can demonstrate, what are they allowed to think, I think it's a very good example of the continuing for the fact that Israel is still controlling this area, even though it keeps saying that, oh no, Gaza is a different entity. We went out of Gaza. We had nothing to do with that. Now, the demonstrations were about several things. There were There were about against the closure of the Gaza since 2007, about the horrible conditions that the people in Gaza are still living, about the right of return. And there were civilian demonstrations. There were something different than it was before. Whole families came there. The picture from there, I mean, I can't go there because, again, part of the Israeli policy of fragmentation. So Israelis cannot go into Gaza. People from Gaza cannot go out of there. So as an Israeli citizen, I cannot go to Gaza. I can see the pictures. But it was different than what we've seen before. Israel got, the response of Israel was violent, illegal, disproportionate. The policy was, they said that. I mean, it's not something that we had to discover. It was openly on the news and everywhere. They had snipers that had orders that they could shoot demonstrators, unarmed demonstrators from the other side of the fence. I mean, there's a fence that separates between Gaza and Israel. Soldiers who are well protected, armed, just shot demonstrators, civilian demonstrators from the other side that never even had any, even if they wanted, they couldn't be of any danger to the soldiers that were on the other side of the fence. So I think those, I mean, in those demonstrations, after those, because of those regulations, the number of people who were killed and injured raised very, very fast. We are talking about more than 200 people that were killed with live ammunition, demonstrators, unarmed demonstrators, most of them unarmed, more than 8,000 demonstrators that were injured by live ammunition. Many people were, I mean, the orders were to shoot on the legs. So many of the demonstrators had their legs had to be cut. And all this was, it wasn't a secret. And I think that this is one of the shocking things. I mean, we knew that while it happened, and that it was clear that Israel is willing to shoot live ammunition on unarmed demonstrations. These were the regulation, which is something that we thought that the minute it will come out, the international community and everybody will be shocked and it will stop quite soon. Nevertheless, it continued more than a year and a half. Basically, the demonstration stopped mostly because of the corona, of the COVID. And one of the things that really helped to silence the criticism was the promise of Israel that I will investigate. We will investigate all those cases that are very the extreme cases that people were killed or injured. We will investigate. The minute this word came out, the criticism was silenced, which is quite surprising, given the lack of accountability by the Israeli government to similar situation. If you look at what happened, for example, in 2014 in the protective edge, in the war protective edge in Gaza, again, Israel promised they will investigate. They didn't investigate. Nothing really happened. So you would think it will, people would understand that, but they didn't. I mean, again, Israel promised they will investigate. They allowed, the international community allowed Israel to continue implement the same policy. And of course, as we write in the report, they didn't. Israel never really investigated what happened there.
So I want to come back to the investigations, the whitewashing part in another round, but I want to just follow up and ask you to talk a little bit about Israel's policy of open fire when it comes to Gaza, as seen in the Great March of Return, but also we've seen this in the rules of engagement in the various military operations against Gaza in the past. And there's been a lot of discussion about the IDF ethos around this. What are the rules? What constitutes a threat? Whether every civilian is treated as a combatant, whether every Israeli combatant has the status of a civilian in terms of protection or in terms of right to self-defense. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because it seems that Israel has sought to create a whole new set of rules of engagement, different from the entire international community when it comes to how it deals specifically with Gaza.
Well, Israel basically thinks that, how should I say that? That there is no limit to what it can do when they claim it is a security threat. Now, international law is vague. International law is not always clear about when an army can shoot. I mean, what are the situations that will be considered legal to kill somebody? It's very, and it's on purpose. I mean, international law by definition, it's a compromise between states, so it can't say to be very specific, but it does create general rules like proportionality, the proportionality principle, and all those principles that are vague. There is some place for interpretation, but Israel is way away from any possible interpretation that any jurist in the world will agree. I mean, I'm not talking about the other jurists in other militaries, but I mean jurists who actually look at international law and believe that international law is supposed to make less suffering as much as possible. And I think Israel is basically, I mean, if you look at how they act and how they interpret it after the war and how they justify all the killings and all the shooting, basically they don't have much limits. I mean, it's enough that somebody will suspect something in many cases, and they never actually justify the numbers that the consequences of the war. Now, if you look at what happened in the demonstrations, the snipers themselves, I mean, they gave interviews. I mean, it wasn't a secret. They gave interviews all around about what were the regulations and when they were allowed to shoot. And basically they say that if they saw somebody suspected, they could shoot him. Nobody will ask them after that. And even if he did something suspicious and then he didn't, so he's still a suspect and they can still shoot him. They are supposed to shoot in the leg, but if they won't shoot at the leg, nothing will happen and nobody will ask them. And you see this kind of relaxation about what is the meaning of shooting somebody also in previous wars in Gaza, in Kasled in 2009 and in Protective Edge in 2014. I mean, it's clear that nobody, I mean, the limits, I mean, it's not clear what the army thinks the limits are there. When they are not allowed to shoot, it's not really clear because they keep saying, well, we saw something suspicious. The intelligence said that there is something suspicious in this specific house, or we didn't know there is a family that was living there. And that's it. And that's the end of the story. Nobody will continue to investigate. So I think that the fact that the impunity that the Israeli army gets, that we wrote in the last report about the demonstration, it's also on previous war. It's always been like that. Even in what Israel is doing in the West Bank, it's all over. I mean, the fact that when you shoot against the regulation, when you kill somebody, somebody has to pay the price. It's not something that goes in Israeli policymakers' head. I mean, basically, they know, and reality proves that they are right, that they know that they can act with almost total impunity, almost 100% immunity when we are talking about the Palestinians. I mean, it's things that we will never see when non-Palestinians are getting killed. And it's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to accept that. But it is basically like that. I mean, when a Palestinian is dead, the whitewash mechanism is working so automatically now and so fast, unless in very, very severe cases, very extreme, nobody will never have to pay any price for whatever they did. And I think that the fact that Israel is able to continue working with such an impunity, totally accepted by Israelis and by the international community, this is what allows it to continue the same policies. It doesn't have any incentive to actually change this policy or stop it.
Okay, so we're going to get to that in just a moment, the question of what has to change or what can change. I will say, watching the policies and the actions around the Great March, it's watching the various wars, Israel's military activity, and they said it's always security, 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 self-defense. And you can have a fight over whether or not it is self-defense to drop a bomb on a house. And these are painful, horrible arguments being made. What happened with the Great March of Return, though, seemed to in some ways even take the mask off that. If the argument is that fully armored soldiers many, many, many hundreds of meters away are acting in self-defense to shoot the knees of unarmed or armed with rocks and things protesters, again, at a distance where they can't possibly harm that soldier. It seemed to really just take them, just tear the mask off the idea that this really is even pretending to be about security at this point. Nuriya, I want to pick up though on exactly this point. The Mezan Report has a section on the Great March of Return and the response, which it concludes that the actions by Israel may constitute war crimes and crimes against humanity. And this fits into a broader discussion about the Great March of Return, the 4 military offenses over the past 15 or so years, which include, I'm going to quote, willful and extrajudicial killing, shelling of inhabited homes, targeting of civilians and civilian premises, the use of excessive force in civilian areas without distinction, proportionality, or military necessity, and the targeting and obstruction of health facilities and personnel, among other things. And it concludes that these, along with large-scale destruction of civilian infrastructure, blah, 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 are evidence of Israel's attempts to destroy life in Gaza. And by the way, the blah, blah, blah is important too. I just want to get to you talking. So will you talk to us about what it means to understand Israel's response to the Great March of Return as part of a regime of apartheid?
Absolutely. So first, I completely agree with the analysis of my colleague Yael, and I'll try not to repeat too much. But the Great March of Return for us, for El Mezan, was in essence a public collective rejection by Palestinians in Gaza, in particular the youth, of the apartheid conditions imposed on them. So in particular, the denial to leave and to return to Gaza, and the unlivable housing, electricity, water, food conditions that they're subjected to. The march was also a demand, as Yael said, for recognition of the Palestinian right of return. And I'll just highlight that 70% of over 2 million Palestinians in Gaza are refugees that are currently being denied their right of return. It was a legitimate exercise of Palestinians' right to free expression and peaceful assembly. It was non-military, and yet Israel responded by, as Yael described, continuing to implement its open fire policy, which is a well-documented policy that allows for the use of excessive force against Palestinians. And we documented the killing of 217 Palestinians within the context of the march, including 48 children, including 9 persons with disability, 4 paramedics, 2 journalists, and there were thousands more who were wounded and traumatized. Now, El Mezan went to court on some of the cases. El Mezan, along with partner organization Adala, challenged Israel's use of force policy in regards to the Great March of Return. And essentially, the state tried to create a new legal paradigm. I mean, they were doing, legal gymnastics, trying to justify their blatantly unlawful use of force against, Palestinian civilians. They tried to create a legal paradigm that combined the laws of war, so international humanitarian law, with international human rights law. I mean, it was given very little, no legitimacy. There was one prosecution, to my knowledge, but Yael, correct me if I'm wrong, and it was in a case taken by El Mezan, and the verdict was completely derisory, completely inadequate in terms of punishment. It was either a 30 or 60-day, community service sentence for a soldier who shot an unarmed child. And Israel, continued to use the deliberate, disproportionate, lethal, unnecessary force that we saw for almost 2 years. And according to our analysis, it did so for two reasons as they relate to the apartheid framework. So the first being that within the state's intent to maintain a system of oppression and domination, Israel's conduct served the purpose of enforcing the closure, essentially, right? Preventing Palestinians from leaving, preventing Palestinians in Gaza from changing the paradigm, the status quo in Gaza, and ensuring essentially the continued physical segregation of the Palestinian population. Israel's conduct, though, also served a secondary purpose, and that was to quash any attempt to resist, to combat, to alter the system of apartheid that it places on Palestinians. So the military responded with excessive and lethal force, with impunity, that even the UN Commission of Inquiry that was tasked by the Human Rights Council at the time with investigating Israel's response, largely qualified as unlawful and possibly amounting to war crimes and crimes against humanity. But how about the legal avenues that Mezan's clients pursue in Israel? So I mentioned one of the cases, but whether through the civil court system, the military investigative system at the Supreme Court to claim their rights, they're also blocked there as well. Their claims are also rejected in the venues that Israel deems to be the legitimate mechanisms for Palestinian complaints. And how about the Palestinian human rights defenders and organizations that challenge the apartheid system using international law or using international legal mechanisms? They're also targeted by the Israeli government with orchestrated initiatives to undermine their work, including the criminalization of human rights organizations themselves, which we saw recently with the criminalization of those 6 Palestinian human rights and civil society organizations. So Israel's response to the Great March of Return, it fits into the apartheid legal framework in that it denied Palestinians in Gaza the rights to life and liberty. And that's one of the inhuman acts making up the crime of apartheid. But it also served Israel's overarching strategy to maintain its apartheid system by quashing any dissent and any challenge to that system.
So that is a perfect lead-in to what I want to ask Yael about, which is I want to talk a little more about the whitewashing. The argument, I think, that is accepted, as you said, in the international community, as soon as Israel says we're investigating, they say, okay, well, be quiet, we're investigating. And then investigations, talk about what that means. And can you talk a little bit, Nuriya mentioned, going through the Israeli courts. Talk about the role of the Israeli courts, whether they're clearly not acting as an avenue for justice, but what does it mean in terms of the courts as a system of enabling or helping in some ways along with its rulings actually define what the legal arguments are to allow Israel to do what it does in Gaza?
I think the whitewash is so part of the army already, so it's not, it's a process that we have to go through. It has to go through all the stages, but the bottom line and the end result is always well known in advance. And the first step of the whitewash is to declare what they are investigating and what they are not investigating. And the most important question, what is the policy? What is the open fire policy? What are the regulations for the snipers? This is not investigated at any point. And it's never like that. It's not even specific to this, to the March of Return. We also saw that in previous wars in Gaza. We see that every day in the West Bank. They never investigate the policy. They never investigate those who actually decide what are the regulations, what will be the policy, the legal advisors, the very high officers in the army, the ministers in the government, the prime minister, the judges that approve that. All those people are never being investigated. It's not even a question. And the only thing that is being investigated is this soldier on the ground that actually hit the trigger. He's the only one that is being investigated, although he doesn't really have a discretion on how to do it. I mean, he's not the one who decides the policy. So that's the first thing to see how they're not really, our Israelis not really investigating. And then we can go and see how they're investigating the actual cases, those extreme cases, the very specific cases that maybe somebody did something against the regulations, which are illegal in the first place. So this is not interesting to see what Israel is doing, because it is not the right question. It's not what's needed to be investigated. And as Nuriya said before, the only one that was actually charged and actually paid some kind of price is one soldier that hit a child, 14-year-old child, and he said that I did that. The soldiers that was with him said, we saw him doing that. Everybody said that it was illegal. And then they say, oh, we couldn't prove the connection between the soldier who actually shot and the boy who died. So we can't actually charge him, and he will, they charge him with some very small disciplinary offense, and he had to do some 1 month community service and something like that. That's the only result for more than 223 Palestinians that died in the demonstration. And I'm not even talk about the people who, the demonstrators that were only injured, because the army even didn't investigate the cases of injuries. They said we only investigate the killing of the cases of death. Nobody really knows why they decide to do something like that. So so we're not dealing with that. But I'm not even, I mean, the main problem and the main thing is that they are not investigating the policy. Now, one of the things they said, they said to justify this, they said, well, the High Court approved the regulations. But the High Court didn't approve in this specific case the regulation. Now, the High Court is totally approving almost everything Israel wants to do in the occupied territories. They approved house demolition, they approved detention, administrative detention, they approved the closure on Gaza, they approved the open fire regulations that allowed killing civilians, etc., etc. But in this specific case, what happened is quite, I mean, the thought that the High Court will actually stop that on this background it's not practical, and the High Court will never intervene in cases like that. And the High Court cannot be conceived as a protector of human rights when we talk about Palestinians. And in this specific case, what the High Court approved is the regulations that the state said to the judges that they applied. Now, the state came to the court and said, okay, we tell the soldiers to shoot only when their life are in danger. The soldiers are only shooting in cases where they do not have any other option. They told this story. Now the judges said, okay, so the regulations are legal. They didn't even see the regulations. And they say, okay, that's legal. Now we know that demonstrations are being killed. We know that we see the news. We know that there are cases of unarmed civilians getting killed and injured. So you will investigate that. We will leave that to the investigation. Now we know how those investigations go. So what the High Court actually said is that, okay, you can continue with this policy. You can do whatever you want. Which again proves how the court system, the Israeli court system, the High Court is the highest court. If the High Court said that, of course, the other court will say the same. That the courts are not a shield for human rights violations when we talk about Palestinians. They act totally different when we talk about cases inside the green line. When we talk about Palestinians, it's a different situation. So Palestinians cannot find protection by the Israeli court system.
Thank you. And while you were talking, I pulled up the Btselem report from January 30th, 2020. We'll have a link. Which notes that when you talk about the Israelis, we're not going to investigate people who are just injured. We're talking here about 155 amputees and 27 paralyzed. So we're talking about not minor injuries. These are life-changing injuries in addition to people who've been killed. I want to shift the focus now. We're getting to the end of this podcast. I want to shift the focus to sort of looking ahead. We've talked about violations. Let's talk a little bit about opportunities, remedies, recommendations, requirements for change. So Nuriya, I want to come to you first. Mezan observes, among other things, I'm going to read this. the Israeli legal system, this is very much what Yael was just saying, the Israeli legal system has played a significant role in ensuring that inhuman acts described in this report are committed with impunity and deny effective access to justice and reparations to victims. Israel has long imposed substantial restrictions and obstacles impeding Palestinian victims' access to justice, reparation, remedy, and remedy for Israel's violations against them. So what would you and Mezan view as the most urgent recommendations for the international community? Whether you're talking here about the UN or individual governments or corporations, for example, business and human rights, or even the ICC. And I want to mention, you dropped into your last answer, you mentioned the 6, and we've done a lot of programming, but for people who are not aware, at the end of last year, Israel designated 6 major human rights organizations in the West Bank to be terrorist organizations. They have yet to produce any evidence of this. The evidence or the arguments that have been produced so far are really guilt by association at 6 degrees of contamination because of alleged relations, political affiliations to the PFLP. But we now have the 6 major groups that operate in the West Bank, existing still with this sword over them of having been designated terror organizations. And one of the through lines amongst those organizations is that they have sought to challenge this impunity, including providing evidence at the UN or for the ICC. So with that as the introduction, Nuriya, back to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm really glad that we focused our conversation today on impunity, because it's the system of impunity that Israel maintains that allows these apparent crimes and violations of international law to continue. It really is impunity that's the driving force of this entire context that Yael and I have been describing today. And so it really is the key word, accountability is the key word when it comes to recommendations and solutions as well. So as I pointed to, Mezan's been engaging with the Israeli justice system for a long time. We've been doing so in good faith on behalf of victims and survivors and their families. And the outcome of that work is conclusively that the Israeli justice system is primarily geared towards shielding its troops, towards shielding its military commanders, towards shielding its government leaders from accountability, from criminal responsibility. To use the terminology of the International Criminal Court, our work shows that Israel is unwilling or unable to act. This is what Yael has been describing as well from the perspective of Btselem. So our asks, of course, focus on accountability, and I won't repeat the list, but at the top is, of course, a call on states to recognize, to acknowledge Israeli apartheid and to ensure that the system is dismantled. Of course, lifting the closure, ending the occupation, and supporting the independence of the ICC while it conducts its investigation. There's also a call on the ICC to include in its investigation the crime of apartheid, the crime against humanity of apartheid, and also of persecution as well. We also have recommendations to impose individual sanctions, so travel bans, asset freezes on suspected perpetrators of recognized international crimes and grave breaches. That's a recommendation that was from the 2019 Commission of Inquiry, mandated by the Human Rights Council, a recommendation to condition arms sales and military and security assistance on Israel's compliance with international law and human rights norms. But Mezan was not recreating the wheel with our list of recommendations. The mechanisms for addressing Israeli apartheid all already exist. And the venues that can deliver accountability and justice to Palestinians, whether at the state level or at international institutions, those are already in place. The problem is that they're not being operationalized for political reasons for Palestinians, or they're being impeded for the same reasons. And this has to end. International law, rules, and procedures have to be implemented as they were intended. without exceptionalizing Palestinians. They have to be implemented according to the letter and intent of the law. And these international institutions and mechanisms have to be allowed to do their work, essentially according to their mandates, according to international rules and procedures. So that's our overarching recommendation, kind of zooming out, to use effectively the tools that we already have.
Thanks. And I'm going to recommend that everyone actually read the report itself, because it is a superbly written and really compelling report. And then they can read all the recommendations there as well. So we'll have that link with this podcast/video. Yael, I want to ask you to more or less address the same question. I'm going to quote your report. The Btselem report closes with this: true policy change will come only when Israel is forced to pay a price for its conduct, actions, and policies, when the smokescreen of domestic investigations is lifted and Israel is forced to reckon with its human rights abuses and breaches of international law. It will have to decide, openly admit that it does not recognize Palestinians as having political rights and as deserving protection, and therefore has no interest in accountability for violating Palestinians' human rights, or change its policy. So those are the final words of the report. So what has to happen, in your view, for the smokescreen to be lifted? Who can or who must intervene? And can you address the role of the ICC, which I think for a lot of people following this issue is seen as the worst idea or the only and best idea?
I think I want to say two things. I mean, first, of course, as Nuriya said before, all the mechanisms are already there, including the ICC. I mean, the legal mechanisms for Israel to end the impunity of Israel are all there. But I think that it cannot be only on the legal level. I mean, it's not a legal question only. And Israel is acting for years with total impunity. Everybody knows that. Now it has this, Israel keeps saying, of course, I'm investigating. Of course, I care about human rights. Of course, I care about international law. It doesn't. It just doesn't. It has to be clear. And Israel has to decide and stop playing this game. If you want to play the game, it has prices. And the fact that Israel is not paying any price, not on the legal level, which is much more complicated, but on the political level, the international community should en masse come to Israel and said, you cannot continue making all these human rights violations and not paying any price for that. Israel is now a well accepted country in all the strongest countries in the world. It has these very generous economic agreements all around the world. The Israeli Prime Minister is a very welcome guest in many countries. Now, these things has to change. Israel has to pay some kind of price for these illegal policies that it is being applying in the occupied territories for more than 50 years. I mean, it's not something temporary. It's not a temporary occupation that is going to end, that the famous Israel democracy that is having on its side this temporary occupation. This is not what's happening here. We are talking about one regime, one apartheid regime in all the territory under Israel control that Israel is applying with convenience. I mean, nobody even say anything against that. And those who said about that, and if you dare to say the ICC, if you dare to say international community should act, I mean, this is something that is not acceptable. And I think that as long as Israel is not paying any price, nobody demands some kind of price, it has no incentive to stop these illegal policies. So some kind of price, whether by the ICC, whether by any country, whether by the international community, some kind of price has to be demanded from Israel if we want this to end.
Thank you. And I think that's a great place to end. I want to take a moment and just thank both of you for your work and for your organization's work on the ground. It is so important. And it's always challenging, but at a time when the work of the human rights sector is being directly attacked by the Israeli government, I think it's really important for us to recognize that work and how vital it is. So thank you for that, and to you and all your colleagues. Thank you both for sharing your time and analysis today. And thanks to our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other great content about Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you subscribe to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Spotify, and you can also watch video versions of the podcast, including this one on YouTube. And with that, I'm Lara Friedman, signing off until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.